to welcome Dr. Mitchell Sutika-Sipus here to the stage, who's going to talk about how AI is changing the business of working with the federal government. Dr. Sutika-Sipus is AutogenAI's Chief Solutions Architect. With nearly 2 decades of AI and data science experience across U.S. government agencies, he's well positioned to help businesses secure more federal contracts through AutogenAI's technologies. His career began in Afghanistan and Somalia, providing GIS datasets to governments. He foresaw the security threat of disinformation and machine learning systems in 2011 and co-founded 2 AI companies, including Telco Labs, which was later acquired. In 2016, he was a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow, working on federal changes for the National Security Council, EPA, and State Department, contributing to federal technology growth and contracting opportunities. Floor is now yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here. And you know what I really like about that last talk right there was Dr. Sargel, is at the very end of it, he said like, hey, I have a problem, who can help me? And there's a handful of people in the room, right? And that's why we come to these things, because we build real relationships, and that's how we can grow our businesses. And on the government side, the government can get things that it trusts, right? There's a human relationship underlying that transaction. Because typically, if you just write a proposal for something, and they've never heard of you, and there's 50 others in the stack, or 80 others, or 800 others, if you're doing something like an AFWorks SBIR, it's going to be really hard to win. And what I want to talk about over the next 20 minutes is a little bit about how the process is changing, how you can position yourself, and talking about this from not just the point of view from the business, but what's happening on the federal side. From my time in changing government acquisitions and also working as a vendor with Air Force groups like ACC, A4 and A2, Material Command, Air Force CDAO, DoD CDAO, DoD TRMC, DevCom, and so on, right? I have found that a lot of times there's still a growing, slow-growing process of building the expertise in the government around AI. There's a lot of excitement around it, so there's constant experiments, but there's also a lot of challenges then that get invented for businesses. So let's just think about the general approach of how we typically do federal business today, right? You go to an event like this, you build a relationship, right? You get someone's business card, you follow up. You try to show that you are differentiated up front. That's usually the best path, right? I'm a big fan of trying to have a non-compete sole source acquisition, personally, right? If I can have some sort of material representation that my capability is truly unique and has no market competition, I can go straight to contract. Just curious, I've heard of some vehicles getting tossed around. Who here has OTAs? Anybody? Few people? Cool. What about competing on things like IDIQs? All right, handful. SBIRs, STTRs? Not many. Interesting. All right, the last time I was at one of these, it was like the total opposite. It was all earlier stage businesses, right, that were less familiar with landscape. This is cool. So a lot of times, right, you can show up and you have, again, that material representation like a patent. Having built 5 different AI companies now, that's not a culture that people do a lot of patents in, right? But I will go out and secure a utility patent for $300, which is good for 1 year, to put it on my contract proposal so that I already have a distinction in what I'm doing when the CO is reviewing, all right, all of the proposals in place and going, oh wow, this one already is different, right? This already has a piece of like evidence that their capability is unique. They have patents in place, these other people don't. Things like that. The best approach though, right? You go with something like this, you meet somebody, you get that meeting, you show your differentiated capability, and you also supply that technical white paper that's going to satisfy the mission owner the warfighter need, and the TPOC. It has that right level of fidelity. So that's kind of a hard one to write. Sometimes those white papers, I've written them as long as 80 pages. But I will write them and map them to the BAA of that organization so that once we talk about it, it already is good to go, right? They're going to say, oh yeah, here's the RFP, and it's going to be like real easy to translate that white paper into the RFP and close the deal, right? So you can truncate the whole process. But it's still getting more difficult, right? Because you would think something like writing that white paper, translating it to the BAA would be a great tool for something like GPT. But that's also starting to get complicated and risky now. I'll talk about why in a minute. So if we think about that as a one standard business model, and then we go up in terms of, okay, well, you don't always have the level of access, and you don't always have the level of certainty, and you don't always get to shape the RFP, right? There are times that you do have to compete. And so what do you need? You need great relationships and opportunities. You need opportunities that match your wheelhouse. You need to make sure your proposals are killer, right? And you need to understand the priorities on the other side so that it scores real high. Right now, this is, on the opportunity side, a lot of the conventional technologies out there, like Deltek and GovTribe, and I love these tools as well, right? Because, we all love sitting there combing through sam.gov, I realize. Just, until your eyes bleed. So, the thing is, those tools are not changing very quickly. And a lot of new players are coming to the field, right? Not just AutogenAI, but there are several tools where we're all pulling the same APIs. We're sourcing all the information. We're pulling in machine learning. And we're able to recommend to you exactly against your past performance, word for word, what you've done, who your PI is, all of that stuff, and pull in open source market information to then help recommend to you new opportunities, not just on sam.gov, but globally. So, I know when I'm talking to people at Deltek about integrating things and getting a sense of where they're going, they're not moving as fast, right? And the landscape is changing really quickly. We're seeing new players arise because this is what machine learning does, right? This is why I got into machine learning starting in 2007, because I'm going to tell you, collecting data in Somalia was not great, right? I was like, can't my camera translate this to an Excel sheet? Why do I have to write all this down, right? So if I can build the technology, I can get the nonlinear returns. Businesses that are building these capabilities, if they truly understand the problem in the landscape and the stakeholders, rapidly getting those gains, which is a great value for you. Right? So you have to start being agile, looking around at maybe there's other ways of sourcing opportunities. Then we get to the actual proposal side. Now, I can spend a lot of time talking to our customers, and I do, and the feedback is helpful of like, oh, I wish that button was over here, right? That's great. I also believe it's probably more valuable to talk to people in the government that you're trying to sell your work to and understand their priorities on how they are reviewing contracts, right? How they're reviewing proposals, how they're making decisions. Right now, there are multiple government agencies. Army's ASA ASAL, for example, is looking at automated RFP writing solutions and scoring. It gets tricky, right? I will tell you straight up, AI-driven RFP writing is probably a good thing for all of us, because the copy and paste methodology today results in a lot of ambiguous, difficult RFPs. I did one recently with the Air Force, 16th Air Force, and there was one sentence buried on page 17 that said something about how this has to align to DAF 7 architecture's orders of battle, something I don't remember. Some sort of DAF set of priorities. And nowhere else was this mentioned, right? So I have one of two options. I can sit there and read all 100+ pages of the RFP, hoping to catch that kind of sentence. Or, ideally, I have the software solve the problem for me in minutes. Now, I have written a lot of proposals in my career as a TPOC, as a PI, and because I got to work in the federal government, changing acquisitions has given me an advantage. But no one wants to spend like 2 weeks building that compliance matrix, right? You think sam.gov is painful, right? The actual proposal writing process is even worse. So building out technologies that can take that 2 weeks and build it out for you in minutes, that's fantastic, right? But not all solutions are equal, of course. So of the tools that are in the space, we focus mostly on word-for-word accuracy, compliance, and quality of writing, right? We deploy our solution in a AFWERX CATO environment called Game Warden, so that you can have full IL5 compliance for your own CMMC requirements. Everything we do has to go through the review process, right, of like with the security team and all of that, so that it maps against the AFWERX ATO. That way we can handle all your CUI data. That's a big part. There's also, beyond the architecture itself, the technology, where the problem with using large language models is they're not made for accurate information. This is the biggest risk for all of us. They're not made to be very specific when you're dealing with complex information. In fact, at 16,000 words, all LLMs will crash in their ability to retain in memory whatever you're talking about as you're using the tool. No matter what kind of test you're running, 16,000 words, every single one of them crashes. And consequently, that means just having like a really great website slapped on top of GPT is not a good idea, right? One, you're exposing your federal contract information or possibly your CUI data to unknown entities. That's not good, so you don't want to do that. Two, it's not going to give you the content you need because it's not able to manage the accuracy requirements. Three, all LLMs are made for generalization. That's why they're so brilliant and seem human-like and when you interact with them, because they generalize information. Think about this. If I give you 100 words right now, just 100 random words, and I said, organize all 100 words in all 100 possible variations, right? And you write this list of all those words and every variation of how all those words could be played out. And then I said, now rank that list by what's the most likely readable, desirable outcome to the worst readable, right? And so at the very bottom, you just have this jumbled mess. And up at the top, you have something quite eloquent. And then I said, okay, rank that, no problem. And then we'd have to calculate what is the probability of each word following the next across that whole stack. And we end up with an average score at the very end. What I just described to you is what LLMs do. That's it. They just assign probabilities to what word follows the next word. Nothing else. So consequently, they are built that over time, they lose nuance the more language you throw in. This is why they all crash at 16,000. This is not a good thing for writing federal proposals. There's a couple things that happen. One, it can't manage the actual word-for-word question, right? The proposals that you ingest, it will basically look at the language and reinvent a summary of that question and then answer the summary. Does that sound like a good idea? Right? The requirements are written very specifically. You need to address every component and subcomponent. You cannot risk that. So this is where in our company, we actually don't even use LLMs for that work. We use very conventional data science techniques that were developed much longer ago because we need to make sure that the word-for-word fidelity is there. This requires a lot more time and expertise. AutogenAI is only 300 people At this point, we have the largest group of engineers working on this in our market, right? So we have about 160 employees. 80 of them are engineers who are focused specifically on linguistic engineering. But this has been why we've been able to become successful, right? We're not an 8-person startup. We have 300 customers around the world. We're a real business. It's a big difference. Once you start moving then into building out your proposals, right? You have to think on what's happening on the federal side. What are people doing with this information? And you know what's crazy? The last time I was at one of these events in DC, it was a couple months ago, I met someone who told me that she was a contracting officer with ONR, and she received 25 proposals, and 5 of them were perfectly identical. Right? Because someone was clever, they were shaving off time, they threw their stuff in GPT, they got their outcome, right? And you know what happened? Those 5 were immediately disqualified. Now what's interesting is there's often a lot of hesitation, like if I utilize AI in competing for government contracts, will I be discounted, right? Or will the government somehow throw my solution out? And actually quite the opposite. The culture right now is really this big focus on automation. And consequently, there's the experiments in the government to utilize AI for scoring, but there's also very much collaboration with companies like ours to make sure that these tools are really meeting the needs of the government, and encouragement among communities. Because now this thing is happening where the government is receiving more proposals for contracts than ever before because everyone got on GPT. The problem is the quality is lower than ever before. And so the pyramid is really steep. What distinguishes the winners out of that group is very clear gains, right? Very massive difference. It's things like really great writing, actually meeting all of the requirements, itemized, laid out, having that clear compliance matrix. It's all of the same basic stuff that people have always wanted, but now there's a pressure to get out more of it, and then you have to change the tools, right? And the fidelity has to even be sharper. There's no room for mistakes. You throw in the needs for CMMC compliance, and suddenly there's only a handful of companies in the market that are able to really serve the business community. And there's only a handful of companies in the business community that's going to use these tools and win those contracts. It's like extremely bifurcated between winners and losers, right? And this is where, of course, then going back of saying building these relationships really matters, right? We don't replace that part. Human expertise really matters. That doesn't get replaced. Moving that expertise through AI technologies to win, that's where it's happening. So we have a few minutes. Can I answer any questions for anybody?
I actually have a question for you. I do a lot of work with companies that are building proposals or building bids, and one of the things I always get a question for is, well, AI can do this for me. Why am I talking to someone like you? Or, what are you actually helping me with? And I think you highlighted some of the key areas that can be a mistake or can be a stumbling block for people that use AI to generate their proposals, such as the story about the contracting officer disqualifying 5 proposals and bids immediately because they were exactly the same. But AI can be a really great tool. What do you think is the biggest struggle people have that use AI tools from taking it from, okay, here's a good base for me, to actually developing something that's compliant and compelling to get them an award?
Historically, whenever we're talking about IT and data and analytics and all that, people would always say, what matters most is the quality of the data, gold in, gold out, all that, right? And that still is the case, but it's different now. So a lot of times people utilize large language models, they're relying on the information that is contained within the model. If you go to a site like Perplexity, it'll also help you pull in other exterior sources, and cite those sources. And it does have some evaluation capability to make sure you're not referencing Reddit in your AFWorks proposal or whatever, right? There's a little bit of reasoning built in. But again, that doesn't replace human expertise at all, right? Chances are you have something buried on a slide, on a PowerPoint, in your SharePoint that you made 2 years ago that is much more significant than anything that's going to be sitting on the internet for this particular opportunity to satisfy that warfighter requirement and that mission owner's need, right? And also, you do this, you understand there's that formula, right? There's that formula in how to write of making sure that you understand the strategy, how this team is executing on that strategy, what is the capability gap, right? Now articulating how I satisfy that capability gap to then win the strategy, right? Mission acceleration. And GPT and stuff isn't made for that, right? So generalized tools are going to give you generalized outcomes. We have a very different approach. We take that, I'll say, just off the cuff, three different things right there. One, we source all of your data in your system with your SharePoint, your Google Drive, whatever it is that you're using, right? It's a closed architecture that is not only meeting all the security requirements, but is also satisfying the information sourcing requirements to win. We want to access that data that's on that PowerPoint from a couple of years ago, and we want to give it to you in seconds and not have you like combing around trying to find this. Especially if you have a growing organization, you have things like turnover, right? That can kill teams. You know, when I worked in Afghanistan, my wife worked at an agency that she did a bunch of security assessments for different regions. And one time she was writing some report, and I was like, didn't you write this report before? Like 2 years ago? And she's like, yeah, but no one can find it, right? And then she submits it, and then someone at ISAF was like, hey, I heard about that report you wrote. I can't find it, right? Like this keeps happening. And at the end of the day, we could have solved the problem just by having Dropbox. That's actually how I started my first company. I realized, oh, I could just get these people Dropbox, and we move on. So same thing. We build AI capabilities that leverage your internal expertise in a closed architecture, not rely on just whatever's sitting on the internet. Two, we don't just rely on GPT. We have developed 60 initial benchmarks on what makes winning proposals. AutogenAI was created by a winning proposal writer. He sold his business for $30 million. That was just a proposal writing consultancy, found himself bored out of his mind, and his friend at Google DeepMind said, hey, you should check out large language models. And that was 2019. So we were the very first company to start doing this. And we have then built out an architecture that doesn't just rely on a large language model. We take all of these benchmarks of what's required to win, and every single model that hits the market, we test them against every single benchmark and cross-validate one benchmark against the next. So that when you utilize the technology, whatever is the most advanced capability in the market today for that requirement, such as generate statistical data, right? Generate a projection off the cost volume. Create a technical management approach tied in with this particular team, utilizing these resumes, right? We're going to source your data. We're going to utilize a full stack of large language models in the background combined with other NLP techniques to then render precisely each data point that's required with the utmost capability that's available on market today. So that's quite differentiating than just like getting on the internet, hoping it works out, right? And then finally, if there's only one winning proposal, it needs to be unique, right? You don't want to be one of those 5 for sure, right? You don't want to be the ones that like just word-for-word copy. But you need to demonstrate something about your company, right? Going back to those comments early on about like that white paper and the sole source procurement and the non-compete justification, right? Like, to me, that's the way to go. I don't want to compete for anything. I just want to win it right up front. Like, that sounds way better. Like, get me all the utility patents you can. Get me all the white papers. I want every meeting. I want a demo live in every meeting. I have taken program managers out of the skiff into that center courtyard in the parking lot or in the Pentagon to then link my phone and run the demo on the laptop off the 5G. Because, like, let's just do it now. Like, let's just see the thing. When I worked at the White House, if people were talking about what the capability was they wanted, and we could prototype that, if I could prototype it while they're talking and turn it around and say, like this, people were onto it, right? Showing, not telling. So the same thing is just like, if we go back to what makes you stand out, you want that piece of writing, that 60 pages, to make you stand out. So there's a few ways that we solve that. For example, with the Air Force, they release a lot of public documentation. I've taken thousands of pages of Air Force documents and made it so that with one button, you just have an Air Force tone of voice. Your whole proposal maps exactly to the way that the Air Force already talks about things. You realize the same acronyms, same reasoning, same logic. Or it can be specific to your company, right? How your company communicates in a particular fashion, differentiated from everybody else. I mean, let's face it, like, I don't know if anyone here has like worked with folks like Lockheed or otherwise, but a lot of the times you end up with a very fragmented landscape of SMEs pulling in on stuff, and you end up with very fragmented products at the end. And ironing all of that out into like something really coherent and clean and consistent usually takes days. We can do it in seconds, get it out the door. So it's 10:20. I'll be around. Love to talk to you, because really relationships is where it starts. And have a great day. Thank you.